I woke up at 3 in the morning because something furry was standing directly on my chest. At first I thought I was dreaming, then I opened my eyes. 5 tiny faces, completely silent, staring at me in the dark like I owed them something. And their mother, the wild Pallas's cat I'd found half dead under my porch 4 months earlier, was sitting on top of my head like she'd lived there her whole life. I didn't move for a long time, and somewhere in that stillness, I realized something had changed in that old house. Something I hadn't felt in 3 years. My name is Walter. I'm 67 years old. I live alone on about 9 acres outside of town, the same property my wife Eleanor and I bought back in 1989. We raised chickens here, fixed fences, planted a garden every spring that neither of us was especially good at keeping alive. After she passed, I kept doing all those things, out of habit mostly. You wake up, you feed the chickens, you fix whatever broke overnight, you microwave something for dinner and fall asleep in front of the television, then you do it again. The house never felt small when Eleanor was in it. After she was gone, it felt enormous. That's what nobody tells you about grief. It's not just the sadness, it's the quiet, the particular, specific quiet of a place that used to have someone in it. The night I found Mara, it was February, a bad one. Snow had been coming down since noon and the temperature dropped hard after dark. I was already in bed when I heard it, a low scratching sound coming from somewhere beneath the porch. Slow, irregular, the kind of sound that stops and starts like whatever's making it isn't sure it has the energy to keep going. I pulled on my boots and my coat and went outside with a flashlight. The beam caught her eyes first, 2 pale, flat discs reflecting back at me from the far corner under the steps. She didn't run. That alone told me something was wrong. I got down on my knees in the snow and looked closer. She was small, smaller than I expected, with a thick gray coat that would have been beautiful if it wasn't matted with ice and mud. Her left front leg was held slightly off the ground. Her sides moved too fast. And she was watching me with an expression I can only describe as exhausted suspicion, like she wanted to be afraid of me but didn't quite have the energy left for it. I didn't know what she was, not exactly, not then. I just knew she was hurt, and it was 12 degrees outside, and I couldn't leave her there. I set a bowl of water just inside the porch, then some leftover chicken from the refrigerator. Then I went back inside and watched through the window. She didn't move for almost 20 minutes. Then, slowly, she dragged herself to the water and drank, just a little. Then she stopped and looked around, checking the trees, the driveway, the roofline, before she looked back at the door where I was standing. I stepped back from the window so she wouldn't see me. That night I left a folded blanket on the porch and didn't go back out. Over the next 2 weeks that was the routine. I'd leave food, she'd eat it after I went inside. I never pushed closer, never tried to touch her. I just made sure something warm was there when she needed it. On the 14th day, she was sitting on the porch when I opened the door in the morning. She didn't run. She looked at me for a long moment, ears flat, body low, tail wrapped tight, and then she looked away, like she'd made a decision she wasn't entirely comfortable with, but had decided to accept. I stood in the doorway and didn't say anything. After a while I just said, "Morning." She didn't answer, but she didn't leave either. I later learned she was a Pallas's cat, a manul, some people call them, native to Central Asia, not something you'd ever expect to find under a porch in rural America. To this day I still don't fully understand how she got here, or how long she'd been surviving on her own. The vet I eventually reached said her leg had been broken and had partially healed wrong, probably weeks before I found her. She'd been managing on her own through most of it. Tough doesn't quite cover it. I named her Mara. I'm not sure why. It just seemed to fit her, something old and quiet and a little unknowable. By March she was sleeping near the fireplace, not next to me, not at my feet, just in the same room, keeping her distance but choosing each night to stay. I started cooking real dinners again, nothing complicated, just something warm on the stove instead of something cold from a box. I told myself it was for me, but the truth is, it felt strange to microwave a frozen meal with an animal sleeping 6 feet away. It felt like bad manners. I started talking out loud again too. Not to her exactly, just talking, the way you do when a house has someone in it. Then, one evening in late April, I noticed something. Mara had been gone most of the afternoon. When she came back, she went straight upstairs, which she'd never done before. I heard her moving around in the hallway. Heard something being dragged across the floor. I figured she'd gotten into Eleanor's old sewing basket again. I didn't go check. I probably should have, because 3 weeks later, I started hearing things at night. Tiny footsteps, soft sounds behind the walls. A kind of muffled squeaking that I told myself, for almost 4 days, was definitely mice. Then one evening I watched Mara carry something small and fluffy up the stairs in her mouth. I followed her slowly to the bedroom door at the end of the hall. I stood there for a moment with my hand on the frame. Then I pushed it open, and I nearly sat down right there on the floor. Beneath Eleanor's old quilt, the blue one she made the winter before she got sick, 5 newborn Pallas kittens were piled together in a tight, breathing heap. Mara stepped past me, lay down beside them, and looked up at me with those flat, pale eyes. She didn't hiss, didn't warn me off. She just looked at me, steady and calm, like she was saying, "You're part of this now, whether you planned on it or not." I sat down on the floor. I don't know how long I stayed there. The room that had held more grief than any room in that house suddenly felt different, smaller somehow, warmer. And then one of the kittens, the smallest one, barely the size of my fist, crawled away from the others, crossed the floor on unsteady legs, climbed onto my boot, and then up onto my knee, and curled up and went to sleep like I was furniture it had always known. Mara watched, and didn't stop it. I sat there in the quiet with a sleeping wild kitten on my lap and thought, I have absolutely no idea what I've gotten myself into. I was right about that. I just didn't know yet how much I needed it. If you've never been woken up at 4 in the morning by a Pallas kitten sitting on your face, I want you to know, it's not a gentle experience. They don't ease into it. There's no warning. One moment you're asleep, and the next there are 4 small paws planted directly on your cheekbone, and a pair of enormous golden eyes staring into yours from about 2 inches away, completely serious, like they've been waiting for hours and your sleeping is frankly an inconvenience to everyone. That was Tuesday. By Wednesday, one of them had discovered the toilet paper roll in the downstairs bathroom. By Thursday, the curtains in the living room had been fully reclassified as a climbing structure. By Friday, I gave up trying to understand what was happening in my own house and just started watching. 5 kittens, it turns out, have a way of filling a space, not just physically, though that too, eventually, once they started getting bigger. I mean the way sound fills a space, the way movement fills it, the way you can't walk from one room to the next without something small and fast bolting past your ankles or launching off the back of the couch, or appearing suddenly on top of the refrigerator like it had always lived there. The farmhouse that had been so quiet for 3 years was now, depending on the hour, somewhere between a nature documentary and a very small, very chaotic circus. I found kittens in the kitchen drawers twice, once in the laundry basket, once, memorably, inside my winter boot, which I discovered only after I'd already put my foot halfway in. Mara watched all of this from the couch, which she had claimed completely and without negotiation, with the patient expression of someone who has already accounted for every possible outcome and finds none of it particularly surprising. What I didn't expect was how quickly they learned me. Not tamed, that's the wrong word, and I want to be careful with it. These were wild animals, Mara especially. She never fully lost that watchfulness, that edge of distance she kept even on her most affectionate days. And as the kittens grew, you could see it in them too. The way they'd freeze at an unfamiliar sound, the way their eyes would go wide and flat at the same time when something moved outside the window they didn't recognize. But they learned my rhythms. They knew the sound of my boots on the porch steps. They knew the particular creak of the back door versus the front door. They knew the difference between the sound of me getting up for water in the night and the sound of me actually getting up for the day. And every morning, without fail, by the time I reached the kitchen, at least 3 of them were already there, sitting in a loose semicircle near the food bowls, not demanding, just present. The way family is present, not because something specific is happening, but because that's where they are when you're there. My neighbor Bev stopped by in May to return a casserole dish she'd borrowed sometime the previous fall. She stood in my doorway and looked past me into the living room for a long moment without saying anything. One kitten was hanging from the curtain rod. Another was inside the fruit bowl on the counter, apparently napping. Mara was stretched across the entire length of the couch with the expression of someone who has recently won a war. Bev looked at me. "Walter," she said slowly, "what is happening in your house?" I thought about it for a second. "Honestly, Bev, I'm not entirely sure. You want some coffee?" She stayed for 2 hours. She held 2 of the kittens. She laughed, really laughed, for the first time since her own husband had passed the year before. When she left, she said she'd come back next week. She did. She's been coming back ever since. Something was shifting. Quietly, the way things shift when you're not watching for it. I started calling people back, not because I'd planned to, but because there was something to talk about now, something that wasn't grief, and wasn't obligation, and wasn't just the weather or the price of feed. My brother called from Colorado, and I talked to him for an hour and a half. My daughter came up from the city one weekend and sat on the kitchen floor for 40 minutes, trying to earn the trust of the smallest kitten, who eventually consented to sniff her hand before retreating behind the stove. She cried a little on the way out. Happy tears, she said. She said the house felt like itself again. I didn't tell her I knew exactly what she meant. But the kittens were growing. That was the thing I kept noticing and kept not wanting to think about too directly. They were getting bigger every week, longer in the body, heavier through the shoulders, and with the size came something else, something older. I'd watch them outside in the early mornings, crouched in the tall grass beyond the barn, absolutely motionless, tracking something I couldn't see. Or I'd see them high up in the oak tree near the fence line, completely comfortable, watching the fields the way their mother watched everything, steady and wide and already planning 3 moves ahead. One afternoon I found one of them, the boldest one, the one I'd privately started calling Scout, sitting at the very edge of the property where the yard gives way to the woods, just sitting there, looking in. He sat there for a long time, then he turned around and came back to the house. But I noticed. A wildlife officer came by in early June. Someone had apparently reported seeing Pallas's cats in the area, unusual enough to warrant a visit. He was polite about it, professional. He looked at Mara, looked at the kittens, asked a few questions, and then he leaned against his truck and said something I'd been quietly trying not to hear for weeks. "Mr. Walter, these animals have strong wild instincts. As they mature, some of them, maybe all of them, are going to feel the pull of open territory. It's not something you can really prevent, and trying to might not be fair to them." I nodded. I told him I understood. After he left, I stood on the porch for a while. Mara came and sat beside my boots, not touching me, just there. I understood what the officer meant. I'd understood it for a while already, in the back of my mind where I kept the things I wasn't ready to think about yet. She had never been mine, none of them had. They had chosen this place, chosen me, the same way a wild thing sometimes chooses a warm spot out of the cold, because it was available and safe and good enough. That didn't make it less real. It just made it something you couldn't hold too tightly. The thunderstorm came on a Thursday night in late June, fast and heavy, the way summer storms move through here, no long warning, just a sudden drop in pressure and then the sky opening up all at once. I did a head count before I went to bed, 4 kittens accounted for. All 5, actually, eventually. And Mara, I thought I'd seen Mara earlier near the fireplace. But when I came back downstairs at midnight for a glass of water, the fireplace was empty. I checked the rooms, the porch, the barn, nothing. By 2 in the morning she still wasn't back. By morning the rain had stopped and the kittens were moving through the house in tight, anxious circles, making a low sound I hadn't heard from them before. Not quite a cry, something quieter and more unsettled than that. I sat with them through the afternoon and tried not to let my mind go where it wanted to go. Then just after 10 that night, all 5 kittens rushed the front door at once, crying loud now, urgent. I got up and opened it. She was standing at the bottom of the porch steps, soaked completely through, one eye partially closed, holding her right side in a way that made something cold move through my chest. She'd made it back, but behind her, at the edge where the yard meets the dark tree line, 2 shapes, low to the ground, watching with pale reflected eyes, coyotes. I got Mara inside and shut the door. The coyotes came back the next night, and the night after that. I started leaving the porch light on, moved the kittens upstairs, reinforced the back door latch that had been loosed since the previous fall. For a week, nothing happened. I started to think maybe they'd moved on. Then I woke up at 2 in the morning to a crash from downstairs that shook me upright before I was fully conscious. I came down the stairs fast and stopped at the bottom. The back door was hanging open, cold air moving through the house. The latch broken off clean. I counted fast. 2 kittens by the fireplace, 1 under the kitchen table, 3 missing. I didn't think, I just moved. Boot, coat, in that order, and out the back door into the dark before I'd even fully registered what I was doing. The porch light threw a pale circle across the yard, and then nothing. Beyond the barn, everything was black. I called out, not their names exactly. They didn't come to their names the way a dog would, but the low sound I'd learned to make that meant safe. "Come here, it's me." The sound that had worked 100 times in the kitchen and the hallway and the yard on quiet mornings. Nothing came back, just wind, and somewhere far off, the sound of the woods settling after the cold. Mara was behind me before I reached the barn. She shouldn't have been outside. She was still hurt, moving stiffly, favoring her right side, and I'd left her upstairs with the 2 kittens who'd stayed. But she'd come down and followed me out without making a sound, and when I turned and saw her in the dark, she was already scanning the tree line the way she did when something was wrong. Head low, ears tracking. I didn't send her back inside. Honestly, I was glad she was there. We went together, me with a flashlight and her moving just ahead of me at the edge of the beam, stopping every few steps to read something in the air I couldn't access. She knew things about this property at night that I never would. I understood that clearly, following her through the wet grass toward the far fence line. The temperature had dropped hard after midnight. My breath came in short, visible bursts. The flashlight beam caught frost on the fence posts, caught the flat, reflective eyes of one of the barn cats watching us from the roof, caught nothing else. No tracks I could make out clearly, no sound. An hour passed, maybe more. I worked a grid, backfield, the space behind the old equipment shed, the creek bank where the kittens sometimes went to drink in the mornings. Mara stayed close but moved independently, circling wider than me, coming back, circling again. Her breathing was labored. I could hear it. I told her to slow down. She ignored me completely. By the time gray light started coming up in the east, I'd covered most of the property and found nothing. My hands had gone numb inside my gloves. My knees ached from the cold in a way they hadn't since last winter. I stopped near the old barn and stood there. 3 of them were out in coyote territory, in the dark and the cold, and I had been right there in the house, and I hadn't heard anything until it was already done. I kept turning that over. The way you do when your mind won't let something go. Kept thinking about the loose latch I'd meant to fix properly weeks ago, and kept putting off. Kept thinking about the wildlife officer leaning against his truck, saying these animals have strong wild instincts, and me nodding like I understood what that actually meant for a night like this one. I sat down on the frozen ground with my back against the barn wall. Mara came and sat beside me. Not nearby, not at her usual careful distance, right beside me, close enough that I could feel the warmth of her through my coat sleeve. She sat there and looked out toward the woods with those pale eyes and didn't move. I don't know how long we sat like that. 10 minutes maybe more. I wasn't going to cry. I'm not saying that like it's something to be proud of. I'm saying I was past the point where crying felt like it had anything to offer. I was somewhere quieter than that. The kind of place you reach when something you love is gone, and the sun is coming up and there's nothing left to do in the dark. Mara pressed her side slightly against my arm. Just slightly, just once. Then she stood up and looked toward the far end of the property, toward a cluster of old outbuildings that had been there since before I bought the place. A small collapsed hay shed at the far corner of the field that I hadn't checked yet because I'd never seen the kittens go near it. She took 3 steps in that direction and stopped, looked back at me. The smallest kitten heard it before I did. He'd followed us out at some point without me noticing. He did that, appeared places without warning, and he was moving through the grass ahead of Mara now, ears up and rotating, tracking something I still couldn't hear. Then he bolted, straight toward the collapsed shed. I ran after him. The shed had partially fallen in on one side sometime during the night, old rotted boards giving way, probably under the weight of frost. Most of the structure was still standing, but the south corner had come down in a low jumble of planks and old timber. I got there and crouched and listened. Underneath the collapsed boards, faint, exhausted, but there, 3 small voices. I started pulling boards before I'd even taken my gloves off. Some of them were frozen to each other, frozen to the ground, and I had to work them loose one at a time. Mara was circling the outside of the pile, growling low, not at me, at the perimeter, watching the field and the tree line, guarding while I worked. One board had a nail in it that caught my palm. I didn't stop. The cold had gotten into my fingers badly enough that I had to use my forearms on the last 2 pieces, lever them up and push them aside, and then get down on my stomach on the frozen ground and reach into the dark space underneath. The first kitten I touched flinched hard and made a sound that broke something loose in my chest. "Okay," I said. "Okay, I've got you. Come on." He came out shaking, then the second one, slower, stiff from the cold. I held them both against my coat. The third one was wedged deeper in. It took another few minutes, talking steadily the whole time, keeping my voice even, keeping my hands as careful as I could make them in the cold, until she finally crawled forward and let me pull her out. All three. I sat back on my heels in the frozen mud with 3 terrified Pallas kittens pressed against my chest, and I just held them there. Mara came around the side of the shed and looked at all 4 of us. Then she made a sound I'd never heard from her before, low and brief and something I don't have a clean word for, and sat down 2 feet away and watched. We walked back slowly. I carried 2 of them inside my coat. The third rode on Mara's heels, close enough to touch her but not quite touching, the way young animals move when they're frightened and need something familiar ahead of them. The 2 kittens who'd stayed behind were at the door when we got back. The smaller one pressed his head against the recovered kittens for a long moment, hard enough that they stumbled. I got the fire going. I wrapped the cold ones in the blanket from the couch, the old wool one Eleanor's mother had made, the one that had survived 30 years in this house, and apparently 2 Pallas kittens was no match for it because they'd already pulled the edging loose. I wrapped them in it anyway. Then I sat back and watched. Mara groomed them one at a time, methodical, thorough, starting from the head and working back. The kittens submitted to it with the particular limp exhaustion of small creatures who have been badly frightened and are now warm and no longer need to pretend otherwise. Tails slowly, eventually curled together. Breathing settled, the room filled with the soft, unguarded sounds of sleep. I watched the fire for a long time, and I thought about Eleanor, not with the sharp edges grief usually had, something softer. I thought about how she would have sat exactly where I was sitting, watching exactly this, and she would have looked over at me and not needed to say anything at all. Some moments don't need words, they just need someone else there to confirm they're real. I felt for the first time in a long time that the room had 2 people in it, not literally, I know the difference, but the feeling was there, quiet and steady and real. Summer moved into fall, the kittens spent more hours outside now than in. Some mornings I'd come downstairs and the house would be empty, fully empty, every one of them gone, and I'd make my coffee and sit on the porch and wait. They always came back by midday, but the gaps were getting longer. Scout had taken to sleeping in the oak tree most nights. I could see him up there sometimes in the early dark, a small dense shape against the bark, watching the field below with the patience of something that has figured out exactly what it is. Mara still came to the fireplace in the evenings. Still sat beside my chair in the particular way she had, not touching, just present, close enough that I knew she was there. But some mornings she was gone before I woke up and back before noon without explanation, and I understood not to ask. The wildlife officer had been right. You can't hold a wild thing in place, you can only make the place worth returning to. The morning it happened was in late October, first hard frost of the year. I came downstairs before light and stood in the kitchen and listened. No sound from upstairs, no small weight shifting on the couch. No footsteps, nothing. I checked every room, the barn, the porch. I stood at the edge of the yard and called out the way I always did. The property was still and cold and completely empty. They were gone, all of them, every single one. I stood there in the frost for a long time. The sky was just beginning to lighten in the east, going from black to a deep blue-gray, and the fields were covered in white, and somewhere in the distance a bird was making a sound that carried clean and clear through the cold air. I didn't go after them. I went inside. I made coffee. And I sat at the kitchen table in the quiet that I had somehow learned, over these months, to hear differently than I used to. The first 3 days were the hardest, not because I hadn't known it was coming. I had. I'd seen it building for weeks in the longer absences, in the way Scout watched the tree line, in the way even Mara sometimes sat at the edge of the yard in the early mornings looking out at the fields with an expression I didn't have the right to interrupt. I'd known. Knowing doesn't do much for you at 6 in the morning when you reach the kitchen and the house is empty and the only sound is the furnace cycling on. I caught myself doing things out of habit those first few days, filling the water bowl by the fireplace before I remembered, stepping carefully around the bottom of the stairs in the dark the way I'd learned to after finding a sleeping kitten there one too many times, leaving a gap under the bathroom door, little grooves worn into the day by months of something being present. I didn't fill them in right away. I'm not sure I could have if I'd tried. They were just there, small absences inside the larger absence, and I moved around them the way you move around furniture in a room you've known a long time. Bev came by on the 4th day. She didn't call ahead. She just showed up with a container of soup and let herself onto the porch the way she'd started doing somewhere around June, and knocked twice, and came in when I answered. She looked around the kitchen, took in the empty bowls, the blanket on the couch with the pulled edging. She set the soup on the counter and sat down across from me at the table. "How are you doing?" she said. I thought about giving her the easy answer, the reflexive one, the one I'd given people for 3 years whenever they asked how I was doing after Eleanor died. "Fine, getting along. Can't complain." Instead I said, "It's quiet again." She nodded. "Different kind of quiet than before though," she said. I looked at her. She was right. That was the thing I'd been sitting with for 4 days and hadn't quite found the words for yet. It wasn't the same quiet. Before, in those first years after Eleanor, the silence had weight to it. It pressed. It reminded you constantly of everything that used to fill it and didn't anymore. This quiet was different. It was just quiet. The ordinary quiet of a house between things. Like a held breath rather than an empty one. I didn't fully understand the difference yet, but I felt it. I started going through the house in those first weeks the way you do after something has lived somewhere for a long time. Not cleaning exactly, more like taking inventory. Claw marks on the doorframe between the kitchen and the hall. 3 sets at different heights, a record of how fast they'd grown without my quite tracking it. A small splintered place on the corner of the coffee table that I'd been annoyed about in July, and now ran my thumb across without any annoyance at all. The couch, which was frankly beyond rehabilitation and which I'd been meaning to replace since 2019, and which I now had no intention of replacing ever. Muddy paw prints on the windowsill above the kitchen sink, preserved somehow in the dust, small and overlapping, a whole season's worth of mornings pressed into the wood. I left them. I thought about Eleanor a lot in those weeks, more than I had in a long time, and differently. There's a version of grief that's mostly about what you've lost. The absence of the specific person, their voice, their habits, the way they moved through rooms. That's where I'd lived for most of 3 years, in the missing. But somewhere in the months with Mara, something had shifted without my noticing. I'd started remembering Eleanor in the other direction, not the absence but the presence, the 41 years of it, the garden neither of us could keep alive. The way she laughed at her own jokes before she'd finished telling them, the blue quilt she'd made the winter before she got sick, folded at the foot of the bed, which 5 Pallas kittens had eventually claimed as their own, and which, I realized now, she would have found absolutely hilarious. She would have loved Mara. That was the thought I kept coming back to. She would have sat on the kitchen floor the first week and just waited, patient as anything, until Mara decided to come to her. And Mara would have, eventually. Because Eleanor had that quality, a stillness that animals recognized, that people recognized too, if they were paying attention. I'd stopped paying attention for a while there. I was paying attention again now. 3 weeks passed, then 4. I kept the porch light on at night. Kept the water bowl filled. Kept the gap under the bathroom door. Not because I was sure they were coming back. I wasn't sure. The wildlife officer's words were still there in the back of my mind. Some of them, maybe all of them, and I knew that was true. I knew there was a version of this story where they didn't come back, where they found territory and stayed there, the way wild things do, and the farmhouse just became a place they'd passed through once. I kept the light on anyway. It was a Tuesday. Heavy snow, the first real accumulation of the season, 6 inches overnight with more coming, and I was drinking my second cup of coffee by the kitchen window watching it come down, when I heard something on the porch, a sound I recognized. I set the cup down slowly. I walked to the door. I stood there with my hand on the latch for just a moment, not hesitating exactly, just taking one breath, the way you do before something you've been waiting for, and then I opened it. They came through the door like they'd been waiting on the other side for hours, and were mildly irritated about the delay. All 5 of them, bigger than I remembered somehow, though it had only been a month, fuller through the chest, moving with a sureness they hadn't quite had when they left. Scout went straight to the food bowl without ceremony. 2 of them disappeared upstairs immediately, already arguing about something in the low chirping way they had. The 4th stopped in the middle of the kitchen, looked at me carefully for a moment as though confirming I was the same person who'd lived here before, and then jumped onto the counter and knocked my coffee cup sideways. And Mara came through the door last. Snow on her coat, ice crystals in the thick fur around her face, moving a little stiffly in the cold the way she always did in winter. She walked past me into the kitchen. She jumped onto the couch. She turned around once. She lay down. And she looked at me with those flat, pale eyes that I had spent the better part of a year learning to read, and which said, clearly as anything, "Well, we're back. Is there a problem?" I laughed. Out loud, alone in my kitchen, the kind of laugh that comes up from somewhere deep and catches you off guard, the kind I hadn't heard from myself in so long it almost sounded unfamiliar. It felt good. It felt embarrassingly, overwhelmingly good. I got the food out. That was 2 winters ago now. The pattern since then has been its own kind of rhythm, different from anything I'd have predicted, different from anything I'd have chosen deliberately, but mine in the way that the best things in a life tend to be, not planned, just arrived at. They leave, they come back. The gaps are sometimes a few days, sometimes nearly 2 weeks. Scout has a territory that extends well into the woods to the north. I've tracked his general range by where I find signs of him, and 2 of the others seem to range together, which I find oddly moving every time I think about it. Siblings, navigating the same wild ground, but they come back, not because I've made them, not because they can't survive without me. They can, clearly, and do, but because this place is part of their range now. Because the porch light is on and the water bowl is full, and there's a gap under the bathroom door, and an old man who knows their particular sounds and has learned, over a long education, not to crowd them. Mara comes back every time, every single time. There are evenings now, ordinary evenings, nothing special about them, that I want to be able to describe properly, but find I can't quite. I'm on the couch, the fire is going, snow coming down outside the window or not, depending on the season. The television is on or it isn't, and the house is full. Not always in the same configuration. Some nights it's 3 of them arranged around the room like they've each independently decided this is a reasonable place to be. Some nights it's all 5 plus Mara, and the living room looks like something between a wildlife sanctuary and a very specific kind of disaster. Last week I fell asleep before 9. I do that more than I used to, and I've made my peace with it, and woke up sometime after midnight unable to move. 2 kittens across my legs, one on my chest, rising and falling with my breathing. Another stretched along my shoulder with his chin resting on my collarbone, and Mara on top of my head, same as the very first night, like we'd come full circle to the beginning of something and she wanted me to know it. I lay there in the dark for a while, pinned completely, and listened to the house. Soft breathing, small snores, the particular chirping sound one of them makes in his sleep that I've never been able to explain but have come to find deeply, unreasonably comforting. Outside, snow fell against the windows. The porch light was on. The house was warm. I think about that night in February sometimes. The flashlight in the dark, the sound of weak scratching under the porch steps, the pale eyes looking back at me from the shadows, exhausted and weary and asking nothing except to be left in peace. I think about how close I came to going back inside. How easy it would have been to tell myself it was a wild animal, and it wasn't my problem, and the cold was too bitter to be kneeling in at that hour. I think about what the farmhouse would have felt like without her. How that particular quiet would have simply continued, heavier each year I think, the way grief gets heavier if nothing interrupts it. She interrupted it. She came in out of the cold and took over the couch and had 5 kittens under Eleanor's quilt and turned my carefully maintained solitude into something I didn't have a name for but which felt, unmistakably, like a life being lived. I didn't do that. She did. I rescued 1 freezing wild cat that February. That part is true. But somewhere between that night and this one, somewhere in all the mornings and the chaos and the long slow winter searches and the empty bowls and the full ones and the particular sound of small feet on the stairs before light, she rescued me right back. The lonely house that had been holding its breath for 3 years finally let it out, and somewhere I think Eleanor is laughing. She always did love to be right,